This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Our Vayikra series focuses on a life of mitzvah observance. We're asking some of the hard questions about Torah observant life through the prism of the mitzvot that appear in the book of Vayikra. Before turning to our episode, I wanted to remind you that sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch with us at podcast@matan.org.il or with the Matan office to sponsor a Vayikra episode. Just before we actually begin today's content, I wanted to remind everybody that the Matan Summer Program, which will be taking place between June 29th and July 17th, is well underway in its preparation and your ability to sign up for it. The program is in memory of my dear friend, Dr. Dodi Fishman-Tobin. And as a sidebar, I'll just say that if you come to the program, I'll meet you there. I'll be opening the program with my dear friend, Dr. Tanya White, and there is an amazingly rich program this summer. The theme is Two Sides of the Story, where we'll be exploring a rich array of perspectives showing multiple sides to Jewish text. There's always a tiyul, there's a trip every week that is somehow related to the learning of that week, and I encourage you to go to the Matan website and sign up for the program. You can sign up per day, you can sign up per week, and you can also sign up for the entire full 3-week program. Parshat Emor is centrally occupied with what is often called Parshiat Moadot, a description of the holiday cycle from Pesach to Sukkot, but it delves into other topics as well. The beginning of the parsha discusses special prohibitions for high priests and lay priests, which means that they are not allowed to become impure for certain deaths, have extra rules about hair shaving, about whom they're allowed to marry, and the demand that they not have physical deformities. These laws and their contemporary relevance and meaning will be the topic of our conversation today. The parsha ends with the somewhat enigmatic narrative of the blasphemer, someone who in the heat of the moment curses in the name of God. This narrative reflects the standard of speech expected of the people. This law is taught to the people after the Israelite is sentenced to death by stoning and illustrates that while there are many commanded laws in the Torah, they are often and sometimes best learned out from real life circumstances. Today I'm excited to introduce a new partner in conversation, Rabbanit Dr. Jennie Rosenfeld, who is currently learning in Matan's Hilchot Chosh and Mishpat program and teaching at MTVA and Matan Chashmonaim. Previously, she served for 5 years as the Manhiga Ruchanit, the female spiritual leader in Efrat, where she also directed the Rabbinical Court for Financial Matters. She completed the Susie Bradfield Women's Institute for Halakhic Leadership Program at Midrash Lindenbaum and received permission to give halakhic rulings, Heter Horah, from Rabbi Shlomo Riskin and Rav Shuki Reich. She holds a PhD in English from the CUNY Graduate Center, where she was a Wexner Graduate Fellow. She co-authored Et Le'ehov, the Newlywed's Guide to Physical Intimacy, which was published in English and then later translated into Hebrew, and is currently completing a book on the interplay of sexuality and religion for unmarried individuals from halakhic and ethical perspectives. Rabbanit Dr. Jennie Rosenfeld, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
You study fascinating topics that are directly relevant to the parshiot that we're in the book of Vayikra, both last week's double parsha and also this week's single parsha. And before we get into our conversation today specifically about the halakhic and modern relevance of these marital restrictions that both impact Kohanim and the women about whom they pertain to, I just wanted you to share a little bit with our listening community how you got into this niche kind of Judaism and sexuality in particular. I really just also want to say that my audience knows that I teach kalot and couples on a regular basis. I can't even tell you how many times I've bought your book and then lost it because I lend it to people and then I've never gotten it back. I've owned it in both languages many times. Right now I have none in my house, but it really was, if I look at the trajectory of good, clear, concise, and halakhic works in the world of intimacy that are not scared, but that are respectful and very clearly aiming at a religious audience. Yours was the first one that was great. And it was, I think, a really big milestone in this kind of new genre of writing for the religious world. And I'm just curious, I remember you talking about this, I would even say 15 years ago. I remember hearing you lecture in the Ramban Shul at a different stage of my life when I was living in Jerusalem. And you've been at this for a long time. And so I'm curious how you got into it. And then how do you decide that the next work is to write a book for the really difficult sexual topics that come up for unmarrieds, as we know that many people are getting married later, and the tension between their halakhic fealty and their very real sexual needs is a massive complexity. So yeah, jump into that wherever feels right.
Yeah. I think I first got into this topic when I was younger. I was someone who always went to shul from a very young age. And I think that I looked to the rabbi's Shabbos morning drasha as a place where things would be spoken about, like the real issues. And I think that—
Can I ask you where you grew up?
I grew up in Riverdale. Won't say more than that. Okay. I don't want to out the, because I think that sitting there, I learned a lot. But one of the issues that I noticed as I started to get older, even just into adolescence, was there's one topic the rabbi never talks about, and why. And I think that that's really where I first got into the topic of sexuality, that what interested me is just there's something that no one is talking about, but I see and experience that this is a part of life. And so let's talk about it, because there's no good to be done by not talking about it. So that's really where I first got into the topic.
And can I just asterisk that and say that you got into this well before there was, both of us, there was a world of social media, meaning this was well before that. It was before, a little bit before, I think, the wave of let's untaboo everything that's taboo, meaning it was, at the root of it was like a real curiosity, right? About life, about like having our modern sensibilities in our modern life and that working with our religious life, right? Meaning
100%, 100%. I think that it was originally coming from a very naive place of growing up and feeling like the Torah, you know, hafoch ba v'hafoch ba de kula ba, and that everything can be found in Torah, and then suddenly feeling like, well, wait a second, why is there an area of life that's sort of being skipped over? As I got, I guess, towards the age of 20 and was learning Daf Yomi, the question came up of, well, this is all over Shas, so really, why are we not talking about it? And then as I got into my 20s and sort of started dating and had friends who were dating and spoke about some of those issues and challenges of singlehood, it was, you know, the question sort of became stronger. So that's really where it came from. The topic of sexuality in the unmarried world is one that I've really been interested in since I myself was unmarried, really since around the age of 20. But what's different about this book is that it discusses the Halakhic issues as well, which is something that at that stage of life I didn't feel prepared to discuss, and that today, after having learned Halakha and also having just been around in the world more, I feel like the Halakhic piece is not something that you could skip over or ignore.
Yeah, no, it's super important. And I won't divulge too much that we're writing in related spaces, although Jennie's focusing much more on the halachic piece, and it's sort of going to be referenced in something that I'm working on also with a partner. Right. And I think that I think even just the act of writing about it, Jennie, is something that's so significant, because what all this is doing is democratizing the information. And what it does is tell me if you agree with this, but there's all these trends that are trying to put more autonomy in the hands of those who are trying to live with integrity in their religious lives. And that along with the lack of talking about all different issues of sexuality, which it's funny, isn't it funny for you and I to talk about this? Because we actually talk about it all the time, but we know that there's such a gap between how present it is in our religious worldview or life and versus how much meets the average person today, which is still almost nothing. It boggles my mind anew every time I sit down with a couple and how little has gotten to them. And, you know, these are people, let's say, that are 25 and under, let's even say. And so, but what a lot of this is doing, and I would put it in the same genre, even as the world of the Pinine Halacha series of Rav Melamed, where, you know, there's been different feelings about it from rabbinic perspectives, but ultimately we're trying to give people information, and information that is coming from learned sources, whether it's professional sources in the sexual realm, and like we met some of our guests last week who deal more with that space, or it's also the sexual realm and the halachic realm, and to let people basically make these decisions, meaning they're making these decisions, but the question is, do they have the halachic information in their hands? Because what happens is that when there is an open education and it's kind of safeguarded by special individuals, or let's say even I would just say Rabbanim in particular, then a lot of times there's sort of like an unbridgeable gap between the information and people's lives.
100%. And I think that gap often leads to a lot of pain. And I can think of many times when I spoke often to a group of singles and even just tried to demystify what are the halachot, what does one need to do to violate the Isur Karet. How many people I've had who've come over to me at the end and said, I wish I knew this. I spent 12 years in the Beis Yaakov system, and here I've been walking right into the Isur Karet thinking that I'm avoiding it. Mm-hmm. And so it's things like that sort of highlight to me anew how important it is to really give people the information, because people are making choices based on sort of partial knowledge, half knowledge, non-knowledge, and are then doing what they're trying to avoid. So
really important work.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of courage to go into those spaces that people don't want to be in them, and it's also to see people in spaces of tension with their halakhic selves. But those who venture into those spaces, there's something moving about it, because we see how much people really want to live halakhic lives, even when they're struggling. Like that's what always moves me.
Yeah.
Whether it's just in the Yotzat Halacha space or teaching couples who are aware that they're doing things that they shouldn't be, but they have really great intentions and they want to figure out how to maintain those intentions, while recognizing what creates tension in their life. And so there's something moving about it, but it's also hard because you have to walk into spaces that are painful, and also that that space between halachic realities and the realities that modern life creates, or even the sexual spaces that modern life says are okay or that are obvious, and not all the tension can be completely dissolved. So it's a courageous thing.
Thanks. I just want to say one other thing, which is I write tshuvot for Meshivat Nefesh, project of Beit Hillel, online responsa, and I see a lot of questions that I get are in this realm, and it's people who really wouldn't ask their shul rabbi or the people in their lives, but find that anonymous space of an online question and ask about it. And I think that Rav Sherlow once wrote, he was really the sort of founder of that online responsa mode, that most of the questions that he got were in the area of sexuality, because it's things that people don't want to ask face to face.
Totally. I think that that's so important, to be able to preserve and create spaces that remain anonymous, as we said, by giving people autonomy to here's a tshuva, right? Or here's this thing you can read with yourself, with your partner, and come to some kind of decision. I think is really important, because otherwise these things, as you said, they don't get asked, and then people end up making bigger mistakes that if they had the information, they probably would choose differently.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, totally. So. Okay, that's really fascinating. So I want us to transition into our topic for today. We have, and before we do that, I just want to recognize that the topic of Isurei Chitun, of prohibited marriages for Kohanim and the women for whom this impacts, there might be someone listening for whom this is part of their life story, and it's a very sensitive topic. So I just want to recognize that and place that here between us, because we will kind of put this topic on a little bit of like a pedestal between us and kind of objectify it, try and think about why. We're going to talk about what are these women, how is the Torah looking at them, how is the Torah looking at Kohanim, and I just want to state before we go in there that this is a sensitive topic, and we recognize that, and we're going to try our best to be sensitive around it, and that is the topic for anyone today. If that's not right for them, just know that that's where we're going with this conversation. But we want to think about it, and in this week's parsha we have a continuation of sort of the characteristic of who the Kohen is, who the priest is in Am Yisrael. And if we look at Am Yisrael as having all these stipulations, all these mitzvot, which is basically forces us, encourages us to live a religious life that's at a higher degree of spiritual tension than those who don't receive these commandments, then the Kohen is going to be the next step up, meaning there's some correlation between having things that one doesn't do. Of course, we know that there are mitzvot that we perform, our ta'aseh, but we have also these prohibitions. And there seems to be a basic foundational logic in the Torah that by refraining from doing certain things, you gain something in the spiritual realm. You're going to tell me if you disagree with this. But in the case of a Kohen who have additional prohibitions, okay, they also have special things they do. Right, they have all these responsibilities. They have all these aseh, all these things that they're going to perform in the mikdash. But along with that, they have additional prohibitions of things they're not allowed to do. And it's sort of at the foundation of it. There seems to be this very strong correlation between refraining from something or molding your identity even more and the spiritual gain or the spiritual characteristic that this person is supposed to be imbued with in the world. And so that's just one way that I sometimes look at sort of the additional level. We're like upping our mitzvot another level when it comes to the Kohen. But A, I'm curious your thoughts on the way I presented that, and B, if you could sort of like take us into what are these prohibitions that the Kohen has?
Yeah. So I just want to add to your caveat at the beginning to say we're having a conversation here. The conversation is not halacha l'maaseh. Anyone who's struggling with one of these questions in real life should ask a question. And what we're talking about here today is not meant to do that work of practical halacha. So that's important for me to say. I will say that I agree with how you presented things in terms of saying that there's something very tangible about refraining from doing something. And I think that sometimes when we look at the mitzvot aseh versus mitzvot lo ta'aseh, it might seem like, well, there's the things that we do and then we're doing something, but what do you do by not doing something? And I think that maybe this is relevant really to the sexual realm in a broader way, which is that sometimes not doing something is really nothing at all, okay? Like in my life, I don't eat pig. I've never wanted to. It's never been a real issue. But sometimes there's something like a form of active restraint, I would say. And I do think that in that moment, in that process for the individual, their relationship with Hashem can be solidified in some way. Now, it's an unpopular idea today. So I was surprised to hear you saying it. I think that in the age that we're living in terms of the modern world, in terms of choice, in terms of, it's not a popular, it's an idea that when limited times that I've mentioned it in a class, in a shiur, I haven't gotten such good looks.
But can I just, I'm so happy we're having this. I love talking to Torah women, really. It's like really the joy. I'll tell you one thing that I do also say to students, and I teach also many younger students. I just said this yesterday in class. It doesn't matter the context of it, because it can be said differently. And I think pretty sure Rabbi Sachs wrote a related idea of this, maybe in Letter in the Scroll. But as humans, we do like to feel that we sacrifice for the things that are important to us. That was one of the big criticisms of letting go of Halakhic observance in the Reform and then partially in the conservative realm, is that one of the theories behind sort of like the decline of participation at all is that people ultimately like to feel they're working hard for something. And so I love the phrase active restraint. I think that's a brilliant phrase. And I think another way of saying something related is to say that there's a religious act in feeling shemasarti et atzmi, meaning I've put myself a little bit on the line. Now, it's something in modern Israel, let's say, mesirut nefesh surrounding kashrut and even Shabbos observance or even Eruv is something people don't feel. You almost never feel it. Yeah. It's so easy that you don't have to think about it. And I was recently in Chutz La'aretz and there wasn't an Eruv where I was, and I was speaking. I had to bring my books before Shabbat and then that, and like I in so many decades I hadn't had to prepare. And on one hand, I felt like it's funny, meaning, okay, it's great to live in a world with an Eruv. But on the other hand, I also recognize that there's an act of tiny bit of sacrifice. That's an easy one. I'm not talking about the sexual realm, which was in the background of what you were saying, but meaning you have to prepare for your mitzvah observance. And that itself has its merit in a life of mitzvot.
Yeah.
So I think it's an important piece. And just because people don't like it, I don't think it shouldn't be said.
Right. So I still say it, Tana. But yeah, I think it's a piece, and I also think there's a question of degree. in terms of how much sacrifice is being demanded of me, and is the sacrifice, like the example that you gave, one time you're spending Shabbat in Chul, and I also have had, a handful of those Shabbatot that I can count where, I couldn't bring a tissue with me and it was the winter and, you want to always have a tissue. And so that's okay. But when the sacrifice becomes something that's sort of too much, it can be a problem.
Totally.
So to find that balance of just enough struggle is be a challenge.
Okay, so bring us into this challenging topic.
Okay, so bringing us into the Isurei Kehuna, I'll just summarize from the beginning of the parsha who a Kohen can't marry. There's a discussion of who a regular Kohen can and can't marry, and then more stringent requirements for the Kohen Gadol, which I won't talk about. I'll just say that all of this is more fully explained in the Shulchan Aruch and Even Ezer, Simanim Vav and Zayin. So if anyone is interested, I would go there and the Nosei Kalim. But the basic restrictions from the Pasuk for the Kohen today is that a regular Kohen can't marry a woman in 3 categories. The first category is a zonah, the second is a chalala, and the third is a grusha. And I can explain a little bit about what goes into each category.
Yeah, because there's a lot of debate about how to define some of them.
Yes.
You would think it's clear, but it's not clear.
Right.
Whether zonah is the same as a chalala, there's a debate, a parshanut debate on that question. But how does the halakha define them?
Right. So I'm going to give a sort of broad, basic answer. Yeah. There's obviously more that can come in or some that can come out. But basically, a zonah includes a woman who's had sexual relations with someone who's prohibited to her. Yeah. Okay? Which either will mean one of the arayot, incest relationships, or a woman who committed adultery, or a woman who had sex with a non-Jew. Mm-hmm. Now, and a convert is included in this category, even the daughter of 2 convert parents. So this category raises a lot of questions. Yep. I think that there's part of the category that maybe is more understandable in terms of a woman who had forbidden sexual relations, a woman who committed adultery. Maybe it's easier, or committed incest. Maybe it's easier for us to understand why she wouldn't be able to marry a Kohen. But in today's world, a woman who's had sex with a non-Jew, and we're speaking here in Yerushalayim, where maybe it's not as common, but in America, where the college campus is a sexual space, it's much more common even for someone from a religious household
to find themselves in that scenario.
To find themselves exactly in that scenario. The question of a convert, what's the problem with a convert, or even the daughter of 2 convert parents who's not actually a convert. Those are big questions in terms of what the logic might be. And maybe we'll get to that. We'll come back to talking about that. Let's just go through the categories. Mm-hmm. The next category is a chalala, which refers to a woman who is the result of a forbidden sexual union between a Kohen and one who he's forbidden to marry. Mm-hmm. Or a chalala could be the daughter of a male halal, or someone who herself was forbidden to a Kohen and nonetheless married him. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if a woman who, let's take a divorcee, because that's maybe the easiest category, the next category, which we didn't discuss yet, but let's say a divorcee marries a Kohen, despite the prohibition of doing so, she'll become a halala, and any children that she has will have that same status.
Yeah, that would mean that the word halal is basically from like l'chalil, right? Is to hollow, meaning to take somebody that had maybe some sort of status and then to empty it of that status. I think that would be how we would understand that word. It's an unusual word. I'm just noting on a parshanut level. It's an unusual word, and a lot of the commentators try and figure out, is a halal a parallel word to zonah, just with a vav in between, because we do have those kind of examples in Tanakh, or is it a different category? Halacha goes into the root of it's a different category of woman, but on a textual level, it's a question whether it seems it was initially meant to be two different kinds of women, or it was the same.
Interesting.
We have our big question here is how do we look at this issue? Meaning, are we looking at these women as many tainted, in air quotes, those who are not watching this, we looking that there's some sort of taintedness or issue with these women, or is it that they're fine, but that there's something here on the side of the Kohen that we're trying to preserve? It's going to be hard to stay away from, I would even say slightly more Kabbalistic, neshama kind of perspectives on this topic, because you might think, if you say, well, it's just a societal disgrace. Okay, I'm gonna lay out some of these elements. It would be, we want a Kohen to be sort of like a picture of something that is almost like perfected, and therefore we want that their marriage is with something that I would call is sort of like a very clean, a clean tabula rasa. That this is just like a first union, and it's a simpler situation, and therefore. And what's the point of it? Is it for the societal vision of what the Kohen's supposed to be? Is it sort of supposed to be this spiritual element that we can't have certain kinds of stories in the backdrop of the Kohen's life? Is this going to minimize or impact his work? Meaning, we have this question, why? Meaning, why is this a problem for him?
Yeah, so I just want to cut in and say that the way you described it is not, I don't think that that's it, because on the one hand, a regular Kohen does not have to marry a betula, does not have to marry a virgin. He can marry an almanah, a woman who is married to someone else for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. He can also marry someone who we might call a zonah, a woman who has been promiscuous with many partners, as long as none of those people have been prohibited to her. Meaning, a young Jewish woman who's had, 50, 100, 200 Jewish male partners that are not prohibited to her by the incest relationships, is someone who will be permitted to a Kohen, while her counterpart, who maybe had sex with a non-Jew once, before she was a Balat Shuvah, for example, will be prohibited to a Kohen. So I think that sort of categorical issue challenges some of the statements of, I think firstly it challenges the statement of saying there's something wrong with any of these categories, or that there's a stigma to these categories, because there are other categories that could be more problematic that the Kohen is permitted to marry.
Yeah. So in that case, so where do we go in terms of understanding this? Meaning, do we go to some sort of essentialist argument about like these particular, the portraits of these women? Are we going to go to an essentialist argument about the priest himself? Do we just say this is a chok, right? And we're not going to try and delve into it? Even if we think for a moment about the widow versus the divorcee, and there's some interesting suggestions out there about what might be the difference between these women, and I think that there's also a counter to this. But even the idea that, well, maybe someone who's been divorced, maybe they still harbor feelings, and they could in theory act upon them and remarry their spouse or want to be with their ex-spouse, versus an almanah who, even if she still harbors love for a lost spouse, can never act upon it. I've seen that explanation put forward, meaning we run into this difficult space of do we try and figure out reasons for, and by that measure kind of objectify and also definitely over-typify what these women might symbolize or be in society, or do we just sort of like let it be and say, okay, this is a chok, and I don't know why this is.
Right. So my personal preference in these areas, and I think this is with a lot of things in the topic of sexuality and halacha, is really just to focus on the chok aspect, and to say, look, we can go into what are the halachot, we can define what are these categories, but ultimately, when we get into the why, that's a place where I think things get more sticky. And I think that things get more sticky, not just in terms of saying something that might be negative. And I don't have a problem with saying something negative, but I do have a problem with saying something that's a lie. And a lot of these logics, like I think I sent you before we met, something that I saw online where someone was talking about, the root of the soul of the convert and the root of the soul of the Kohen. And one can sort of build all of these castles in the air. But ultimately, are they actually true? And I feel like there's a certain level of maybe arrogance in saying, I know why HaKadosh Baruch Hu made these prohibitions. Ultimately, I think that we're people, we're not machines. We need reasons. And ultimately, the Kohen, a single Kohen who's never been married before and is in his mid-30s and is finding it increasingly hard to date because many women are either divorcees or, if he's in America or outside of Israel, have had sex with a non-Jew. He's going to need to do difficult work to find the reason that makes it worth it for him. But I don't feel that I can honestly say, here's a reason that's going to unify all of these categories and bring them together. And so I don't want to invent a reason. I'd rather say, this is halacha, let's learn it, let's understand what it is. But ultimately there's going to be a space of commitment. And ultimately there's also going to be a space of each person giving themselves the reasons that motivate them to observe something when it's difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece. I as you're speaking, I'm thinking about a comment that I saw from Adatz Hoffman, where he says that what is the difference between a divorcee and the case of a widow, because a divorcee, there was a marriage that had, he calls it a bad ending. His words are acharit ra'ah. Meaning that there was a negative piece in the way that went, and we can't have a situation where a Kohen is with a woman who was, again, in the words he's using in Hebrew, is sent away, meaning gerushin from gerish ota, but he means that she was divorced and that we don't want to bring that into the space. Now, as I say this explanation, I have an internal cringe, right? Meaning, and that's the challenge of, if you go into these explanations, you come up against ideas that can be really grating and really, really difficult, because we also know many people who are married and are in very bad situations.
Yes.
And so it's very difficult, as we've said, to sort of categorically go with some sweeping explanation. This is a real tension, though. I just want to broaden this piece in our halachic lives in general. As you said, it's not just in the realm of sexuality, meaning there are certain realms that challenge us more than others. Most people aren't b'yisurin over cutting their nails on Shabbat. You know what I'm saying? But meaning there are certain areas that are going to challenge us more than others. But there's constantly this question of, do I try and find a reason to allay the inner tension? And maybe there's a moment of life where that's a good approach for someone and a moment of life where that's not a good approach. Or am I a person, or in this particular realm that they're struggling with, that just to say, I'm not going to understand it. It actually works better for me not to try and do an archaeological dig here, because I might come away having less respect or appreciation for this than I did if I would just leave it as it was. I think that it's a real question, and that thinking people who are trying to live through their halachic lives and come up against challenges are often find themselves having to sort of make decisions about that. Do I search for an explanation that's going to make me feel better? Or do I say, I don't really want an explanation here, because I also might come up against some things that,
right,
that don't work well.
Right. Though ultimately I do believe, firstly, that it's something that's very personal. The reason why one person observes something is probably different than the reason why the person next to them observes it. It's like we stand next to people in shul, and what I'm thinking about when I'm davening, that's different than the person standing next to me and in front of me and behind me. And that's okay. We're all there ultimately davening. And I think that needing a reason is a human need. And I would imagine that most people, and again, from the Kohanim that I've spoken to who have found themselves in tension with this, I take the leap to assume that there has to be something that a narrative that they're giving themselves that makes it all worth it. Now, the narrative that they're giving themselves might not be the reason behind the mitzvah.
Yeah.
It might be just saying, I'm a Kohen, I'm committed to that, I'm committed to my family lineage, history, and I'm committed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It could be something as simple as that. Or it could be thinking about the specific women and saying whatever it is that it takes to say for a person to feel okay with that mitzvah observance that's hard. And there I would, never judge anyone. Everyone needs their internal narrative that allows them to live life.
What I think is also interesting is that these halachot have another branch to them, which is halakhic, again, air quotes, solutions to some of the questions that arise. So I wonder if we could just talk about them a little bit, meaning I even personally know a story of a couple who, he went back a few generations, which is one way that sometimes people go deal with this, and they discovered that maybe they weren't Kohanim, and they ended up basically, he stopped being, he grew up his whole life doing Birkat Kohanim, and he didn't renounce his kehuna, but he basically discovered that it maybe wasn't true, that they were actually a family of Kohanim, and then he married a divorced woman. That is an interesting route, but I'm curious if you could also explain to us some other halachic tools, right, which is another branch, right? When people are having difficulty in halachic observance, and I talk to people about halachic toolboxes, meaning we have what we just spoke about, what you spoke about so movingly about, like the narrative that people are building for themselves and their commitment to halacha and how people live with it. But there's also a certain degree of work that we can do in the halachic realm sometimes to help alleviate a situation. And basically say, well, you thought you were in this halachic issue, but actually we can remove this as a barrier because it may not be relevant right now. So what are some of the other tools that are used in the halachic conversation? Right.
So again, I'll put out various tools, but what I want to say is that there's a sort of separate question of how do we use these tools? I don't know if it's how much should we use these tools? Should we be running to these tools? Should we only be running to them in extenuating circumstances? There are a lot of questions around it. And I'll also say that even with the various loopholes, it's not always that simple.
Yeah.
So you gave the example of a person finding out, I would say, delving into their family history and finding out that they're not really a Kohen. Okay? Now, the Kohanim today are all mostly what's called Kohanei Chazakah. Kohanim because of the assumption that they're a Kohen. They're not Kohanim miyuchasim with like a ktav yichus with like that it goes back to Aaron HaKohen tracing their kahuna. At the same time, there are certain types of Kohanim where it might be easier to look back and find, I'd say a gap in their family tree where maybe one of their ancestors married someone who was prohibited to them, thus creating a line of chalalim who then, are not subject to the Isurei Kahuna. So that's a possibility. It's not always a possibility that will work, depending on the family. Now, one could also sort of use this issue if there is a suffix, if there's a doubt in the family lineage. In other words, not something that one could put their finger on and say, okay, here's something. The great grandfather, married a divorcee, and now you guys are all halalim. But something where there is a doubt or a break in the lineage. It's something where some halachic authorities would use that as a suffix and potentially use other sfeikot with that. Okay, we have the concept of a sfeik sfeika, but again, the concept of a sfeik sfeika, double doubt, is a concept that's halachically difficult. And what constitutes a doubt? Do both of the doubts have to be in the same person? Sometimes we might have one doubt with regard to the Kohen and one doubt with regard to the woman that he's seeking to marry. Is that good enough for a sfeik sfeika? There are definitely achronim who say that that's not good enough. But using sfeikot is one way that could potentially be used. There are other issues which I sort of don't want to get into at the very end in terms of believing the woman, what constitutes actual, say, for example, a woman who had sex with a non-Jew, what constitutes testimony, what constitutes something that she's saying that we could believe, should we believe her? And then something that I've seen in contemporary tshuvot, I just looked through some tshuvot from Rav Chanan Aflalo, Shut Asher Chanan. He's a contemporary Sephardi posek living today in central Israel. And in some of his tshuvot, I see that the situation matters, and that sometimes if both members of the couple are Baalei Tshuva, how will they react to this? There could be more of an imperative to find a loophole. The context matters, the situation matters. Someone asking the question before a first date is very different than someone asking the question when information has come out after 20 years of marriage. And then there's all sorts of situations in between. A couple is engaged, a couple just got married. There's so many different sort of complex variables to the question that ultimately if someone needs to ask a question, they should do so, and it's not something that we could even attempt to answer here.
And just another example, if anyone would just Google it, you can find examples of, and it was done by, I forget, one of the big Batei Din in Israel, where they basically annulled the first marriage of the divorced woman. I believe that was the case.
Okay.
Where they found that the edim for the witnesses for the first marriage were related and therefore were not actually kasher. And this is a massive thing to do because if you have children from that union, that creates a whole different issue for the children. But in this particular case, they basically uprooted her status as having been married before. I'm just saying that that's a extremely far-reaching, was something that made the mainstream news. It was such a scandalous decision.
That's so interesting, but I'm assuming that she hadn't received a divorce. Because there, and truth is, we didn't talk actually at the beginning about the divorcee, but even what's called reach haget, even not a regular divorce will make her prohibited to a kohen. So I'm assuming the example you're mentioning, she had just been married before but not divorced, and they were able to annul the marriage.
Yeah. But again, there are these different sort of tools that are utilized, but again, as you're saying, they have to be utilized in very specific scenarios and with sort of rabbinic guidance if you're already getting into a situation that's as extreme as these.
Yes, 100%.
And in terms of sort of the average person who's walking around, or I would say your average Kohen who's walking around, right? And so I've seen resumes, right, where people write on it, I am a Kohen, so that people know, what's relevant to suggest or not. Like, meaning, I'm just curious, is this a topic that's come up, relative, if you've seen this in a way that people speak to you or ask you questions? Is this a topic that comes up?
The truth of the matter is I haven't gotten a specific question on this. I've had Kohanim who have approached me after teaching or lecturing who've just complained or just wanted to share the pain of being in their situation. Maybe I'll just mention an article that the Rabbanit Dr. Anat Sharbat wrote in the recent book, Kotvot Halacha, edited by Rabbanit Michal Tukachinsky and Dr. Chayuta Deutsch. It's a book of Halakhic writings by women. And she wrote an article there about a Kohen and a woman who has had sex with a non-Jew in the past, and raised there really interesting questions in terms of the need for disclosure, the need for what you're saying, like on a shidduch resume, a person mentioning the Kohen status, or shadchanim asking invasive questions to potential women. So that's a really interesting article that has, I would say, a different approach to this topic.
Which goes back to the question of how much disclosure is needed, and sometimes that being also a way to avoid complication. Right.
I think ultimately there's a question of when using various halachic mechanisms. I don't know if the word loopholes, we can use the word halachic loopholes. When is it something that ultimately will become standard and we won't give it a second thought. Things like pruzbul, things like mechirat chametz that have become totally mainstream, right? No one is looking askance at the person who sells their chametz. So the question, I think, with some of these surei kahuna, will they ever enter into that category, or will they not? Or when is it more of like, this is poretz geder, right? Like breaking down the what should be not touched. Ultimately, I think it's something we can't necessarily know in advance. And ultimately, I think that each situation really is different and warrants halakhic consultation. And my prayer would just be that the halakhic authorities that one consults should have that human sympathy and just a basic understanding of humanity, coupled with halakhic knowledge and expertise to give an answer that a person can live with.
Rabbanit Dr. Jennie Rosenfeld, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and to honestly, I think very clearly be an example of what you just wished for, meaning that I wish that when people speak to halakhic authorities that they're able to be met with that. For many people, to speak with someone who both has halakhic knowledge and a good working ability to be sensitive to the people around them should not be something that is rare. It should be something that we can find. And often just a meeting with a halakhic person who is able to see the person in front of them can be redemptive in and of itself. Sometimes that unloads some of the burden that people walk around with, is just the ability to be seen by somebody who for them almost like embodies or represents the halakha itself, is often something that could be a really healing for people. So I'm going to join 100%. In with that tefillah. Thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.